I was cargo once. Let me tell you what that means, truly means, in the holds of those vessels that drift between the stars like great black coffins, gathering their harvest from a million worlds. Let me tell you why no one escapes the black ships. Not because escape is difficult, not because the walls are thick and the guards are many, though both of these things are true, but because escape itself becomes a concept as alien as hope, as distant as the light of the worlds we left behind. I know this because I lived it. I know this because I was one of them, one of the taken, one of the gathered, and I am still here, still breathing, still capable of testimony, only because the Imperium found a use for me that did not require my dissolution. I was 17 years old when they came for me. My name then was Viola Kos, and I had lived my entire life in the underhive of Morvena Secundus, a world of iron and ash that clung to the edge of the Segmentum Tempestus, like a barnacle on the hull of a dying ship. I did not know I was a psyker. I did not know the word, did not understand the meaning of the dreams that had begun to bleed into my waking hours, the whispers that came from corners where no mouths existed, the way my mother's fear had grown thick and rancid in the final months before they found me. I thought I was going mad. I prayed for madness in truth, for madness could be hidden, could be endured in silence, could be carried to the grave without anyone ever knowing the depths of the corruption that had taken root within my skull. But there is no hiding from the black ships. Across the breadth of the Imperium, on worlds beyond counting, the tithe collectors move among the populations like wolves through flocks of sheep, and their eyes see what normal eyes cannot. They carry devices that smell the warp upon us, that taste the taint of our awakening gifts. And when those devices begin to sing their shrill and terrible songs, there is no appeal, no mercy, no exemption that coin or influence can purchase. I have learned since that day that this collection happens everywhere, always, in every corner of humanity's realm. That even as I was dragged from my mother's arms, screaming curses I did not understand, in languages I had never learned, 10,000 others were being gathered on 10,000 other worlds, all of us feeding into the great hungry maw of a machine that has operated without pause for 10 millennia. They did not explain where I was going. They did not need to. The arbitrators who held me wore masks of black iron, featureless and cold, and behind them walked figures in robes the color of old blood, their faces hidden beneath hoods that seemed to drink the light itself. I know now that these were adepts of the Astra Telepathica, the scholastic order charged with the harvesting and processing of my kind. But in that moment, they were simply nightmares given flesh, monsters from the stories my grandmother had whispered in the darkness when she wanted me to behave. They moved with the efficiency of long practice, binding my hands in manacles that burned cold against my wrists, fitting a collar around my throat that seemed to press inward upon my very thoughts. The whispers that had plagued me went silent. The dreams that had bled into waking ceased their flow. For the first time in months, my mind was my own, and I understood, with the sudden, terrible clarity of a death sentence read aloud, that this silence was not a gift but a warning, a taste of what awaited me in the dark between the stars. I did not know it then, but in that moment I had joined a congregation of the damned that stretched across the galaxy, millions of souls each year, gathered from every world that owed allegiance to the Golden Throne, all of us bound for fates that defied simple description. Some would be fed to the Emperor himself, their souls consumed in the daily sacrifice that keeps the Astronomicon burning. Others would be broken and remade into astropaths, their eyes burned away, their minds forcibly wedded to the Emperor's light. Still others would be deemed too dangerous for any purpose but destruction. Their lives ended in chambers designed for such endings, their ashes scattered into the void without ceremony or remembrance. And some, a precious few, would be found useful in other ways, ways that I would come to understand only through years of service that followed my own processing. The shuttle that carried me from Morvenna's surface was small and cramped, filled with the stench of fear sweat and the sound of weeping. There were 17 of us in that hold, ranging in age from a child of perhaps 8 years to a man whose hair had already gone white with age, and not one of us spoke a word to the others. We had each been fitted with the same cold collar, the same burning manacles, and we sat in the darkness with our thoughts turned inward, each of us alone with a terror too vast for sharing. I remember thinking that surely someone would come for us, that there must be some mistake, that the Imperium could not simply take its citizens without cause or trial. I remember clinging to that hope like a drowning woman clings to driftwood, even as the shuttle shuddered and lurched and carried us upward through Morvenna's polluted atmosphere toward whatever waited above. The black ship hung in the void like a splinter of darkness against the stars. I saw it through a porthole no larger than my hand, and even that glimpse was enough to lodge itself in my memory forever. A vessel of impossible size, its hull the color of deep space itself, its running lights the sickly green of bioluminescence in some deep ocean trench. It had no name that I could see, no markings that identified it as belonging to any fleet or crusade or expedition. It was simply there, waiting, patient as death itself. And as our shuttle approached, I felt something that the collar around my neck could not entirely suppress. A pressure, a weight, a sense of psychic mass so vast that it seemed to bend the very fabric of reality around itself. I understood then, though I lacked the words to express it, that this ship was a predator, and that I had been delivered into its jaws. 17 of us entered that vessel's holds on that day. I alone survived to see Terra's light. The others, the child, the old man, the woman who had been a scribe, the boy who had been a soldier, all the others whose names I learned and lost across the long journey inward. They were consumed by the process of the ship itself, by the grinding machinery of assessment and processing that waited within its dark corridors. Some were deemed too weak and were cast into the furnaces that powered the vessel's great engines. Some were deemed too dangerous and were executed in chambers specifically designed for that purpose, their bodies dissolved in vats of acid to ensure that no trace of their tainted flesh could spread its corruption further. Some simply stopped existing between one day and the next, taken by things that moved in the deeper holds, things that the crew spoke of only in whispers, and the adepts addressed only in prayer. And I remained. I endured, not because I was stronger than the others, not because I was smarter or more cunning or more blessed by the Emperor's grace. I remained because the mathematics of the black ships decreed that some portion of their cargo must survive intact, must reach Terra in sufficient condition to serve the purposes that awaited them, and I happened to fall within that portion. It was not fate. It was not destiny. It was logistics, cold and simple and utterly indifferent to my suffering or my prayers or my terror. That is the first truth I can offer you about why no one escapes the black ships. Because escape implies that you matter, that your individual will has weight against the machinery of the Imperium, that somewhere in the vast grinding apparatus of human survival there exists a gear that cares whether you live or die. The black ships teach you otherwise. The black ships teach you that you are cargo. You are material. You are a resource to be processed, assessed, utilized or discarded according to needs that exist on scales so vast that your entire life, your entire world, your entire lineage, from the first breath to the last, is merely a rounding error in the calculations of 10,000 years. I was cargo once. Let me tell you what I learned in the holds of those ships. What truths were burned into me across a journey that took 11 months and cost me everything I had ever been. Let me tell you why no one escapes, and why, in the end, I no longer wish to. The first thing you learn aboard a black ship is the smell. It is not a single odor, but a symphony of them, layered one upon the other, like the strata of some geological formation built from suffering rather than stone. The sharp chemical bite of sanctified unguents, the copper-sweet undertone of blood, both fresh and ancient, the thick, cloying presence of incense burned in quantities sufficient to choke the air itself, and beneath all of these, persistent as a heartbeat, the particular stench of human fear, concentrated and fermented across centuries of continuous operation. I smelled it the moment the shuttle's ramp descended into the receiving bay, and I smell it still, even now, even after all these years, rising unbidden from my memory, whenever I close my eyes and allow myself to drift back to that place between places, that vessel of collection that became my world for nearly a year of standard time. They processed us like grain through a mill. The 17 of us from Morvenna were added to a stream of bodies that flowed through the ship's intake chambers in an endless river of flesh. Hundreds of souls gathered from dozens of worlds, all of us stripped and examined and catalogued by servitors whose eyes had been replaced with clicking brass lenses and whose hands moved with the mechanical precision of things that had long ago forgotten what it meant to be gentle. I remember the cold of the examination tables, a metal that seemed to drink the heat from my body and give nothing back. I remember the pain of the sampling needles, thick as styluses, driven into my spine to extract fluids I did not know I possessed. I remember the voice of the adept who oversaw my processing, a thin, reedy sound that emerged from a vox grill where his mouth should have been, reciting numbers and classifications that meant nothing to me, but would determine everything about my future. Gamma level potential, stable enough for extended observation, mark for choir assessment, tertiary priority. Those words decided my fate. Those words determined that I would live, at least for a time, while others heard different words and were led away to different chambers and were never seen again. I did not understand this then. I understand it now with a clarity that brings no comfort. For understanding the machinery of your own survival does not make that machinery any less terrible, does not wash the blood from the gears or silence the screams that echo still in the corridors of my memory. The holding cells were not cells at all, not in any sense I had understood the word. They were vast dormitories carved into the ship's lower decks, cathedral-sized spaces lined with thousands of narrow bunks stacked 6 high, each one barely wide enough to contain a human body lying flat with arms pressed tight against its sides. There were no walls between us, no privacy, no separation of any kind. We slept and woke and suffered in full view of one another, a congregation of the damned pressed so close together that I could hear the heartbeats of those above and below me, could feel the trembling of their bodies transmitted through the metal framework that held us all. The lights never fully extinguished. The temperature never varied. Time itself became a meaningless abstraction, measured only by the arrival of the feeding servitors with their tanks of grey nutrient paste and the departure of the collection teams who came at irregular intervals to harvest those whose processing had been completed. I witnessed my first death on the 3rd day. A man in the bunk across from mine. I never learned his name. never heard him speak a single word, began to convulse in the small hours of what passed for night aboard that vessel. His body arched and twisted against the restraints that held him to his bunk, and from his mouth came sounds that I had never heard a human throat produce, wet tearing noises interspersed with words in languages that predated human speech itself. The collar around his neck flared with sickly light, runes I did not recognize blazing crimson against the black metal. And for a moment I saw something looking out through his eyes, something vast and hungry and utterly inhuman, that regarded us all with the cold curiosity of a child examining insects before it begins to pull off their legs. The sisters came for him. They moved through the dormitory, like ghosts of vengeance given form, their armor the color of dried blood, their faces hidden behind helms that showed no features at all. I had heard whispers of them even in the underhive of Morvenna, the sisters of silence, the witch-seekers, the null maidens who cast no shadow in the warp and whose very presence was anathema to things like me. As they approached the convulsing man, I felt something I had never experienced before, a lessening, a diminishment, as though some essential part of my being was being slowly drained away by their proximity. The whispers that had been silenced by my collar did not return, but I became aware of their absence in a new and terrible way, aware of the hollow space within my skull where they had once resided, aware that these women in their blood-red armor could reach into that space and crush whatever remained of my gift as easily as I might crush an insect beneath my heel. They did not save the man. Salvation was not their purpose. One of them produced a blade from somewhere within her armor, a sword that seemed to drink the dim light of the dormitory, and with a single motion she opened his throat from ear to ear. The blood that poured forth was not red, but black, thick, and viscous as tar, and where it touched the metal of his bunk, it hissed and smoked as though the very substance of him had been corrupted into something caustic. The sisters worked in silence, always in silence, stripping the body from its restraints and carrying it away to whatever disposal awaited such failed vessels. And within minutes, a servitor had arrived to clean the bunk and prepare it for the next occupant. No one spoke of what we had witnessed. No one needed to. We had all understood, in that moment, the precariousness of our existence aboard this vessel, the thin membrane that separated continued survival from dissolution into something worse than death. The man had not escaped. The thing that had tried to claim him had not escaped. Both had been ended with the same brutal efficiency, the same cold methodology, the same utter indifference to anything resembling mercy or compassion or individual worth. And I understood then that this was not cruelty for its own sake, not sadism or malice or any human failing. This was necessity, pure and absolute, the price that must be paid to move cargo like us across the stars without allowing the things that hungered for our souls to use us as doorways into the material realm. Across the galaxy, I knew, this scene was repeating itself on hundreds of other vessels, thousands of other vessels, an endless harvest of human potential being gathered and processed and refined for purposes that the cargo itself could never fully comprehend. The Imperium required psychers to function. The Astronomicon required souls to burn. The Emperor himself, seated upon his golden throne in eternal torment, required a daily tithe of sacrifice that had been paid without interruption for 10,000 years. We were not prisoners. We were not victims. We were fuel gathered from a million worlds to feed the fires that kept humanity's civilization burning against the darkness that pressed close upon every border. The days blurred into one another, each one identical to the last. We were fed at intervals I could not measure. The grey paste forced into our mouths by servitors who did not care whether we were hungry or full, awake or asleep, willing or resistant. We were examined at intervals I could not predict, pulled from our bunks by strong hands, and carried to chambers where adepts in crimson robes performed tests I could not understand, measuring aspects of our being that had no names in any language I knew. We were watched at all times by eyes both human and mechanical, by sensors that detected fluctuations in our psychic potential, by systems designed to identify the first signs of corruption before that corruption could spread to others. And slowly, inevitably, our numbers diminished. I learned to track the empty bunks, to note which faces disappeared between one feeding cycle and the next. The child from my shuttle, a girl of 8 years with hair the color of copper wire, vanished on what I estimated to be the 12th day. The old man lasted longer, nearly a month by my reckoning, before the collectors came for him, and he was led away to whatever fate awaited those deemed unsuitable for further processing. The woman who had been a scribe, the boy who had been a soldier, the others whose names I had learned in whispered conversations conducted in the brief moments when the watcher's attention was elsewhere. One by one they were taken, and one by one I remained. And with each disappearance, I felt the weight of my own survival pressing heavier upon my shoulders. Why me? Why did I endure when so many others did not? I asked myself this question 1,000 times in the darkness of that dormitory, and I never found an answer that satisfied. I was not stronger than them, not purer, not more blessed by the Emperor's grace. I was merely Vila Kos, a girl from the Underhive who had been cursed with a gift she never wanted, and taken from a home she would never see again. There was nothing special about me. There was nothing that should have marked me for survival, while so many others were consumed by the machinery of the black ships. And yet I remained. And yet I endured. The first revelation came to me in the 4th month, during one of the examinations that had become as routine as breathing. The adept who oversaw my assessment was older than most, his flesh more machine than organic, his voice emerging from a vox grill that crackled with age and poor maintenance. He did not speak to me. They never spoke to us, never acknowledged that we were anything more than materials to be measured and sorted. But I heard him speak to his assistant, words not meant for my ears that lodged themselves in my memory nonetheless. This one shows unusual stability. The gift is present but dormant, contained by factors we do not fully understand. She may be suitable for the sanctioning if she survives the journey. The sanctioning. I did not know what the word meant, but I clung to it like a drowning woman clings to flotsam in a storm-tossed sea. It was a future, a possibility, a hint that survival might lead somewhere other than the furnaces, or the acid vats, or the chambers where things worse than death awaited those who could not be used. For the first time since my taking, I allowed myself to feel something other than terror and despair. It was not hope. Hope was too fragile a word for what bloomed within my chest in that moment. It was determination. It was the cold, hard resolve to endure whatever came next, to survive whatever tests awaited, to reach whatever destination this vessel was carrying me toward. I did not know what the sanctioning would require of me. I did not know what I would become if I survived it. But I knew, with a certainty that went beyond thought or reason, that I would not die in the holds of this ship, would not be dissolved or discarded or forgotten among the countless others who had made this journey before me. I would reach Terra. I would see the light of Sul. I would learn what purpose the Imperium had found for me. And I would never, ever forget what I had witnessed in the belly of the black ships. The cost of survival, the price of continuation, the terrible mathematics that governed the existence of every psyker born within the Imperium's borders. The ship spoke to us in the 6th month, not with words, not with any sound that could be heard by ears of flesh and bone, but with something deeper, something that bypassed the collars around our necks and reached directly into the trembling meat of our minds. I woke from a sleep I did not remember entering to find every soul in the dormitory sitting upright in their bunks, every face turned toward the same point in the darkness, every mouth hanging open in an expression that was not quite terror and not quite ecstasy, but some unholy fusion of the two. The ship was passing through something. I understood this without knowing how I understood it. Some region of space where the veil between the material realm and the howling madness beyond had worn thin as parchment, and the things that dwelt on the other side of that veil were pressing close, so close, hungry for the feast of souls that travelled within these iron walls. I heard them. Emperor, forgive me, I heard them. Voices beyond counting, whispers that promised everything I had ever wanted and everything I had ever feared, offers of power and pleasure and release from the suffering that had become my entire existence. They knew my name. They knew the names I had forgotten, the names of ancestors dead for centuries, the secret names that exist within the soul itself and are never spoken aloud. They called to me with those names, beckoning, cajoling, threatening, their words wrapping around my thoughts like serpents coiling around prey. And I understood in that moment why the black ships were built as they were, why their hulls were lined with sigils of warding and their corridors patrolled by the Sisters of Silence, and their cargo kept sedated and suppressed at all times. We were beacons. We were doorways. We were cracks in the wall of reality through which the things beyond could pour like water through a broken dam. The ship's defenses held. The Geller field that wrapped us in its invisible embrace did not falter, did not fail, did not allow those hungry voices to do more than whisper their poison into our sleeping minds. But something was different when we emerged from that passage. Something had changed in the fabric of our little congregation of the damned. I saw it in the eyes of those around me, a haunted quality that had not been there before, a knowledge of things that should not be known, a weight of revelation that pressed upon our shoulders, like chains forged from pure despair. 3 of us did not survive that passage intact. The first was a woman named Sorel, a former administratum clerk from a world whose name I never learned, who had spent the previous weeks teaching me the basics of Imperial Gothic in whispered conversations conducted during the feeding cycles. She had been kind to me, kind in a way that seemed impossible in that place of suffering, and I had come to think of her as something like a friend, the only friend I had made since my taking, the only connection to humanity that remained to me in that sea of isolation and fear. When the passage ended and the voices faded back into the silence from which they had emerged, Sorel did not move from her bunk. Her eyes remained open, staring at nothing, and from her lips came a thin trickle of blood that was the wrong color, too dark, too thick, carrying within it the stench of corruption that I had come to associate with those who had been touched too deeply by the things beyond. The sisters came for her. They always came. The second was a boy of perhaps 15 years, thin and pale, and marked with the ritual scars of some feral world at the edge of the Imperium's light. He had never spoken a word in all the months I had observed him, had never made a sound of any kind, and I had assumed that he was mute or mad, or simply broken beyond the capacity for communication. But when the passage ended, he began to scream. Not words, not anything that resembled language, but a raw animal sound of pure terror that went on and on without pause for breath, without interruption of any kind, as though something had reached into his chest and found a well of suffering so deep that it could never be emptied. They sedated him with needles the length of my forearm, and even then the screaming continued, muffled now but no less terrible, echoing through the dormitory like the cry of a dying god. I do not know what became of him. I do not wish to know. The third was myself. I did not die. I did not scream. I did not fall into the catatonia that had claimed Sorel, or the madness that had consumed the scarred boy. But something within me had shifted during that passage. Some barrier that had kept the worst of my gift contained had cracked under the pressure of those whispering voices. And in the days that followed, I began to experience things that the collar around my neck should have made impossible. I saw shadows that moved against the light, heard whispers that came from within my own skull, rather than from the things beyond, felt the presence of other minds pressing close against my own, like bodies in a crowd, each one distinct, each one carrying its own cargo of fear and hope and despair. I was awakening, truly awakening, in a way that went beyond anything I'd experienced before my taking. And I understood, with a clarity that brought no comfort, that this awakening was precisely what the black ships existed to contain, to control, to channel toward purposes that served the Imperium, rather than the horrors that sought to use us as doorways into the realm of flesh and blood. If I had been on Morvenna when this happened, if I had been among the ignorant masses who knew nothing of the warp or its dangers, I would have been a catastrophe waiting to unfold, a beacon calling out to things that should never be called, a crack in reality through which nightmares could pour into the material world. The black ships had taken me before that could happen. The black ships were saving my world, my people, everyone I had ever known, by removing me from their midst before my gift could become their doom. This was not comfort. This was horror of a different kind. For I understood now that I was dangerous, that every soul in this dormitory was dangerous, that we carried within us the seeds of destruction that could unmake entire worlds if left unchecked. The Imperium did not gather us out of cruelty or malice, or the simple desire to inflict suffering upon the innocent. The Imperium gathered us because it had no choice, because the alternative was to leave us scattered across 1,000,000 worlds, like unexploded ordnance waiting for the spark that would set us off, because 10,000 years of bitter experience had taught humanity's rulers that psychers left untended were psychers who became doorways for things that fed on human souls, like a man might feed on bread. We were not victims. We were weapons that had not yet been aimed. The examinations increased in frequency after the passage, where before I had been assessed perhaps once in every 10 cycles. Now I was pulled from my bunk every second cycle, carried to chambers I had never seen before, subjected to tests that went far beyond the simple measurements of my early days aboard the vessel. They opened my mind with drugs that tasted of copper and ash, forced me to reach out with senses I was only beginning to understand, made me touch other minds, and report what I found within them. I learned the shape of madness in those sessions, learned to recognize the particular signature of corruption that marked a soul as lost beyond recovery, learned to identify the stable from the unstable, with a precision that made me valuable to my captors in ways I had not anticipated. I became a tool. I became useful. And with usefulness came privileges that I had not known existed aboard this vessel of suffering. They moved me from the common dormitory to a smaller chamber, shared with only a dozen others, all of us marked with the same designation I had received during my initial processing: potential candidates for the sanctioning, souls stable enough to be shaped rather than simply consumed. We were given better food, thin gruel that contained actual nutrients rather than the grey paste of the dormitories. We were given time to exercise, brief periods in chambers where we could move our bodies, and remember what it felt like to be something other than cargo waiting to be processed. We were given, in small and carefully measured doses, something that resembled hope. But hope aboard a black ship is a dangerous thing. I learned this truth through the fate of a man named Torvus, a former soldier who had served in the Astra Militarum before his gift had manifested and marked him for collection. He was older than most of us, his body carrying the scars of campaigns fought on worlds whose names he spoke with a reverence that bordered on prayer. And in the weeks after our transfer to the privileged quarters, he had become something like a leader among us, not by any formal appointment, but simply by virtue of his experience, his calm, his unshakable conviction that we would survive this journey and emerge on the other side as something greater than what we had been. He spoke of the sanctioning as though it were a gift rather than a trial, described the astropaths and sanctioned psychers he had encountered during his military service with something approaching admiration, painted pictures of a future in which we would serve the Imperium with honor and purpose, rather than being consumed by it like fuel thrown into a furnace. I wanted to believe him. Emperor, help me. I wanted to believe every word that fell from his lips, wanted to embrace the hope he offered, with the desperation of a drowning woman offered a rope. Torvus attempted to escape on the 217th day of our journey. I do not know how he did it. I do not know what resources he had gathered, what plans he had made, what allies he had recruited among the crew or the other cargo. I know only that I woke one cycle to find his bunk empty and the chamber filled with the particular silence that follows catastrophe, the held breath quiet of people who have witnessed something terrible and are waiting to learn whether they will be punished for the mere fact of their proximity to it. They found him in the maintenance corridors 3 levels below our quarters, his body twisted into shapes that human anatomy should not permit, his face frozen in an expression that I see still when I close my eyes and allow my memories to drift back to that place. He had not been killed by the ship's crew. He had not been executed by the Sisters of Silence or dissolved in the chambers reserved for those deemed too dangerous for continued existence. He had been killed by the ship itself. The black ships are not merely vessels. They are prisons designed by minds that understood the nature of the cargo they would carry, built with systems and safeguards and traps that exist on levels both physical and metaphysical, constructed to contain not merely bodies but souls, not merely flesh, but the warp-touched essence that makes psychers what we are. Torvus had triggered something in his attempted flight, some defense mechanism that I could not understand and the crew would not explain, and whatever he had encountered in those maintenance corridors had ended him with a thoroughness that left no doubt about the futility of resistance. There is no escape from the black ships, not because the walls are thick, not because the guards are many, not because the void of space offers no refuge for those who somehow break free of their confines. There is no escape because the ships themselves will not permit it, because they are designed from keel to spire to ensure that cargo like us reaches its destination intact or not at all, because the Imperium cannot afford to lose even a single psyker to the void when every soul is needed for the fires that keep humanity's civilization burning. I understood this now. I understood it in my bones, in my blood, in the deepest reaches of my warp-touched soul. We were not passengers on this journey. We were not even prisoners in any meaningful sense of the word. We were components of a machine that had been operating for 10 millennia, parts that would be fitted into their proper places upon arrival, or discarded if found wanting, and the machine did not care about our hopes or our fears or our desperate dreams of freedom. The machine cared only about function, about purpose, about the endless hungry need of an Imperium that consumed its own children, by the billions simply to survive another day against the darkness that pressed close upon every border. Torvus had hoped. Torvus had believed that he could escape, that his will and his courage and his soldiers' cunning could find a way through the defenses that contained us. Torvus was dead now, his body ejected into the void, his name already forgotten by all but those of us who had known him in the privileged quarters. I did not hope after that. I did not dream of escape or freedom or any future beyond the one that the black ships had already determined for me. I simply endured one cycle after another, one examination after another, one day closer to terror and whatever waited for me in the shadow of the Golden Throne. The machine would use me, or it would discard me. Those were the only options that remained. And I had learned, at last, to stop pretending otherwise. Terror filled the viewport like the eye of a god. I had been permitted to see it, a privilege granted to those of us who had survived the full journey, who had endured the 11 months of processing and assessment and quiet horror that transformed raw cargo into something the Imperium might find useful. They brought us to an observation deck I had not known existed, a chamber high in the ship's spire, where great windows of armoured glass looked out upon the void, and there, hanging against the black velvet of space like a jewel of impossible size, I beheld the cradle of humanity for the first time. It was not beautiful. Beauty was too small a word. The world below us burned with light, not the natural light of a living planet, but the artificial radiance of a civilization that had consumed every inch of available surface and reached upward into the heavens themselves. Hive spires climbing so high that their peaks brushed the edges of the atmosphere, orbital platforms and docking rings surrounding the planet, in layers upon layers of iron and adamantine. Ships beyond counting, moving in patterns too complex for my mind to track, each one a vessel of purpose in the great machinery of the Imperium's heart. I had known, intellectually, that Terra was the throne world of humanity, the seat of the Emperor's power, the center around which 1,000,000 worlds revolved in their endless dance of loyalty and tribute. But knowing is not the same as seeing. Knowing is not the same as feeling the weight of 10,000 years of history pressing down upon your soul, as you behold the place where it all began, where it all continues, where humanity's last best hope sits entombed upon a throne of gold and agony. I wept. I am not ashamed to admit this. I wept for the beauty and the horror of it, for the scale that dwarfed everything I had ever known or imagined, for the realization that I was about to set foot upon soil that had been walked by the Emperor himself in ages beyond memory, that I would breathe air that had once filled his lungs, that I would become part of a story so vast that my entire existence was merely a single word in a library that stretched across the stars. The tears that fell from my eyes were not tears of joy or sorrow, but something older, something that had no name in any language I knew, an emotion that existed only in the presence of the truly sacred, the truly terrible, the truly divine. They brought us down in shuttles that descended through the atmosphere like falling stars. I remember the heat of re-entry, the shuddering of the hull as we plunged through layers of polluted air, the glimpse through a tiny porthole of hive spires rising around us like the fingers of buried giants reaching toward a sky they would never touch. I remember the sound of the engines shifting from descent to approach, the grinding of landing gear extending beneath us, the final shuddering impact as we touched down upon a platform that jutted from the side of a structure so massive that I could not see its edges, no matter which direction I turned my head. And I remember the smell, incense and ozone, and the particular chemical sweetness of recycled air that had been breathed by billions of lungs over thousands of years, air that carried within it the accumulated exhalations of humanity's greatest and most terrible civilization. The Scholastica Psychina received us with the efficiency of long practice. We were sorted once again, divided into groups based on criteria I did not understand, led through corridors that seemed to stretch forever into the bowels of a complex that might have been a city unto itself. I saw thousands of others like us, cargo from other black ships that had arrived before ours, all of them moving through the same processing machinery, all of them wearing the same expression of exhausted terror that I felt upon my own face. The scale of it was staggering, not dozens or hundreds, but thousands upon thousands of psychers gathered from across the galaxy, all of them converging upon this place, all of them waiting for the sanctioning that would determine their fate. I learned later that this process never stops. Every day, ships arrive bearing their harvest of souls. Every day, the Scholastica Psychana processes new cargo. Every day, the Emperor's tithe is paid. They gave me a cell of my own, a space barely large enough to contain a cot and a waste receptacle, its walls inscribed with wards that I could feel pressing against my gift, even through the collar that still encircled my throat. I was alone for the first time in nearly a year, alone with my thoughts and my fears and the growing awareness of what awaited me in the chambers that lay somewhere deeper within this labyrinthine complex. The sanctioning. The process by which raw psychers were transformed into sanctioned servants of the Imperium, or destroyed if they proved unworthy of that transformation. I had heard whispers of what it entailed. I had seen the hollow eyes of those who had undergone it and emerged on the other side. I had not understood, not truly, not until they came for me. The chamber they brought me to was vast and circular, its ceiling lost in shadows that seemed to move with purpose despite the absence of any light source that might cast them. In the center of the space stood a throne of black iron, its surface covered in cables and tubes and devices whose purpose I could not begin to guess. And before that throne stood a figure in robes of purest white, his face hidden beneath a hood that seemed to contain nothing but darkness, his hands folded in an attitude of prayer that might have been reverence or might have been resignation. "Vila Kos," he said, and his voice was like the rustling of pages in a tomb, dry and ancient and utterly without warmth. "You have been assessed and found suitable for the sanctioning. Do you understand what this means?" I did not answer. I could not answer. My throat had closed around words that refused to form. "You will be bound to the Emperor's light," he continued, as though my silence was expected, as though he had delivered this speech 10,000 times before, and would deliver it 10,000 times again. "Your gift will be opened fully, the barriers that have contained it stripped away, and in that moment of absolute vulnerability, you will be exposed to his radiance. Those who are strong enough will survive this exposure and emerge transformed, their powers sanctified, their souls marked forever by his touch. Those who are not strong enough will be consumed, their essence added to the choir of souls that sustains the Astronomicon, their sacrifice serving the Imperium in death as they could not serve it in life." He paused, and I felt the weight of his attention, even though I could not see his eyes. "There is no third option. There is no refusal. There is only the sanctioning and what comes after." They stripped me of my robes, my collar, everything that had marked me as cargo in the holds of the black ships. For the first time in 11 months, I felt the full weight of my gift pressing against the inside of my skull. Whispers and visions and sensations that I had almost forgotten existed flooding back into my consciousness with the force of a dam breaking. I gasped, staggered, would have fallen if strong hands had not caught me and guided me toward the throne that waited at the center of the chamber. The metal was cold against my bare skin. The restraints that closed around my wrists and ankles were colder still. And then they began. I cannot describe what followed. I lack the words, lack the framework, lack the capacity to translate into language an experience that existed entirely outside the realm of human comprehension. They opened my mind with tools that were not physical, reached into the deepest recesses of my being with fingers that were not flesh, stripped away every defense I had ever built and left me naked before something so vast, so bright, so utterly overwhelming that I ceased to exist as an individual entity and became merely a mote of dust caught in the radiance of a star. I saw him, not with my eyes. My eyes had rolled back into my skull, my body convulsing against the restraints that held me to the throne, blood streaming from my nose and ears and the corners of my mouth. I saw him with something deeper, something that the sanctioning had torn open within me, and what I saw was not a god and not a man, but something in between, something that had been both and was now neither, something that existed in eternal agony upon a throne of gold, while the weight of humanity's survival pressed down upon shoulders that had been bearing that burden for 10,000 years. He was dying. He had been dying since before I was born, since before my grandmother's grandmother had drawn her first breath, since before the hive cities of Morvenna had risen from the ashes of whatever world had existed before them. He was dying, and he was not dead, and in the space between those two states, he endured suffering beyond anything I had experienced in the holds of the black ships, beyond anything I could have imagined in my darkest nightmares, beyond anything that any living being should be capable of surviving. And yet he survived, and yet he endured, and yet he held back the darkness that pressed close upon the borders of reality, his will alone standing between humanity and the things that hungered for our souls in the realm beyond the veil. I understood in that moment of terrible communion why the black ships existed, why the tithe of psychers must be paid, why 1,000 souls were fed to the golden throne each day, their essences consumed to keep the Astronomicon burning, their sacrifices necessary to maintain the beacon that allowed humanity's ships to navigate the hell dimension of the warp. It was not cruelty. It was not malice. It was mathematics, cold, terrible, inescapable mathematics. The calculus of survival on a galactic scale, the price that must be paid to ensure that humanity endured another day, another year, another millennium against the horrors that sought to devour us. The black ships were not prisons. They were arteries, carrying the lifeblood of the Imperium from its extremities to its heart. And I was a cell in that blood, a tiny component in a system so vast that my individual existence meant nothing against the needs of the whole. The sanctioning burned through me like fire through dry wood, searing away everything I had been and leaving behind something new, something different, something that bore my name and my memories, but was no longer entirely the girl who had been taken from the underhive of Morvenna Secundus 11 months before. I felt my gift unfold fully for the first time, felt the barriers that had contained it dissolve into ash, felt the full weight of what I was and what I could become, pressing against the boundaries of my consciousness like a tide against a seawall. And I felt him, the Emperor, his attention, vast and terrible and cold as the void between stars, turning toward me for the span of a single heartbeat, examining what the sanctioning had made of me, judging whether I was worthy of continued existence or whether I would be better served as fuel for the fires that kept his light burning. I did not beg. I did not pray. I did not plead for mercy or salvation or any of the things that I had prayed for in the darkness of the black ships. I simply endured. I simply survived. I simply was. And that somehow was enough. The sanctioning ended. The light receded. I returned to myself, to my body, to the chamber with its throne of black iron and its robed attendants and its smell of incense and blood and the particular chemical sweetness of sanctified oils. I was alive. I was changed. I was something new, something that the Imperium could use, something that had been forged in the fires of the Emperor's own radiance and emerged on the other side still capable of service. I had survived the black ships. I had survived the sanctioning. I had become what I was always meant to become, and I understood, at last, why no one ever escapes. Not because escape is impossible, but because escape is meaningless. Because there is nowhere to run that the Imperium's need does not reach. Because every psyker born within humanity's realm is already claimed by the machinery that keeps our species alive, already marked for the tithe that must be paid, already destined for the black ships or the pyres or the slow consumption of uncontrolled power, eating them alive from the inside out. We do not escape because there is nothing to escape to. We do not escape because the alternative to the black ships is not freedom, but annihilation, our own, and the annihilation of everyone we have ever loved. The black ships are not our prison, they are our salvation. I have served the Imperium for 43 years since my sanctioning. My eyes are gone now, burned away in the ritual that bound me to the Emperor's light, replaced by the smooth skin and subtle scars that mark all astropaths who have undergone the soul binding. I see with other senses now, senses that were given to me in that chamber of black iron, senses that allow me to perceive the warp and its currents and the messages that travel through that hell dimension, from one end of the Imperium to the other. I have sent 100,000 communications across the void. I have received 100,000 more. I have been the voice of admirals and generals, of planetary governors and inquisitors, of all the myriad functionaries whose words must travel faster than light if humanity's civilization is to hold together against the darkness that presses close upon every border. I am useful. I am necessary. I am a component in the machine that keeps the Imperium alive. And I have never forgotten the black ships. They come still, even now, even after all these years. Vessels of black iron drifting between the stars, gathering their harvest from 1,000,000 worlds, carrying their cargo of damned souls toward terror and the fates that await them in the shadow of the golden throne. I sense them sometimes, when my duties bring me close to the great docking rings of Terra's orbital platforms, when my gift brushes against the psychic mass of thousands of untrained psychers pressed together in the holds of those ancient vessels. I feel their fear, their confusion, their desperate hope that somehow they will be the exception, that somehow they will find a way to escape the fate that has claimed so many before them. They will not escape. None of them will escape. I know this with a certainty that goes beyond knowledge, beyond experience, beyond even the terrible wisdom that the sanctioning burned into the core of my being. They will not escape because the black ships are not merely vessels, but extensions of the Imperium's will, tendrils of a vast organism that reaches into every corner of human space and claims what it needs to survive. They will not escape because the systems that contain them were designed by minds that understood the nature of the cargo they would carry, built with safeguards and defenses that exist on levels both physical and metaphysical. They will not escape because escape itself is an illusion, a comforting lie that the mind tells itself when faced with truths too terrible to accept. I have watched the black ships arrive for 43 years. I have seen the cargo they carry processed and sorted and fed into the machinery of the Imperium's survival. I have witnessed the sanctioning of thousands, the consumption of thousands more, the endless cycle of harvest and processing that has continued without interruption since the days when the Emperor still walked among his people. And I have come to understand something that I did not understand when I was cargo myself. something that I could not have understood until I had spent decades as a functioning component in the machine that I once feared and hated and dreamed of escaping. The black ships are an act of mercy. I know how this sounds. I know how it would have sounded to the girl I was, the terrified child who was dragged from her mother's arms and carried into the darkness between the stars. But I have seen what happens to psychers who are not collected, who are left to develop their gifts without guidance or control, or the protection that the black ships provide. I have felt them die, their minds brushing against mine in their final moments as the things they accidentally summoned tore their souls from their bodies. I have witnessed the aftermath of their failures, worlds consumed by demonic incursion, populations slaughtered by the thousands, warp rifts opening in the fabric of reality because one untrained psyker in some forgotten corner of the Imperium lost control for a single instant. We are dangerous. We are weapons that can go off without warning, doorways that can open onto horrors beyond description, cracks in the wall of reality through which the enemies of humanity can pour like water through a broken dam. The black ships take us before we can become disasters. The black ships process us before we can destroy everything we love. The black ships are not cruelty inflicted upon the innocent. They are surgery performed upon a patient who does not yet know they are sick. Removal of a tumor before it can metastasize and kill the entire body. This is the truth that the cargo cannot see, cannot understand, cannot accept, until they have been processed and sanctioned and integrated into the machinery of human survival. This is the truth that I could not see when I was weeping in the holds of those vessels, when I was watching my fellow cargo consumed by the processes that determined our fates, when I was learning the cold mathematics of an imperium that values individual lives only insofar as those lives serve the continuation of the species. We do not escape the black ships because the black ships are not something to escape from. They are something to be grateful for. I think sometimes of the others, Sorel, who was kind to me in the darkness, Torvus, who dared to hope, the child with hair like copper wire, the scarred boy who screamed without ceasing, the 16 souls who boarded that shuttle with me on Morvena Secundus and did not live to see Terra's light. I carry them with me still, their names inscribed upon the walls of my memory, their faces preserved in the amber of recollection, even as the decades strip away everything else that I once was. They did not survive. They were not suitable. They were consumed by the machinery that I was fortunate enough to pass through intact. I do not mourn them. Mourning implies that their deaths were tragedies, that some better fate awaited them if only circumstances had been different, if only the universe had been kinder, if only the mathematics of survival had worked out some other way. But there was no other way. There is never another way. The black ships take what they take, process what they process, use what they can use, and discard what they cannot. And the cargo that does not survive was never going to survive, was always destined for the furnaces or the dissolution chambers, or the slow consumption of powers they could not control. Their deaths were not tragedies. Their deaths were necessities, small prices paid against the vastly larger debt that humanity owes for its continued existence. I understand this now. I accept this now. And I am at peace. Not the peace of happiness, not the peace of contentment, not the peace of a life well lived and a future bright with promise. The peace I have found is colder than that, harder than that, forged in the fires of the sanctioning, and tempered by 43 years of service to an imperium that does not know my name and would not care if it did. It is the peace of understanding, of acceptance, of knowing one's place in a machine so vast that individual suffering becomes meaningless against the needs of the whole. The black ships will continue their harvest long after I am gone. 1,000 years from now, 10,000 years from now, vessels of black iron will still drift between the stars, gathering their cargo of damned souls, carrying them toward terror and the fates that await them in the shadow of the golden throne. The process will not stop. The process cannot stop. The Imperium requires psychers to function, requires souls to feed the Astronomicon, requires the endless sacrifice of the few to ensure the survival of the many. This is the truth of the black ships. This is the truth that no cargo ever escapes, not because the walls are thick or the guards are many, but because the truth itself is inescapable, written into the fabric of reality by 10,000 years of bitter necessity. We are cargo. We are fuel. We are the price that must be paid. And in paying that price, we become something greater than ourselves. Threads in a tapestry of survival that stretches across 1,000,000 worlds, notes in a symphony of endurance that has been playing since before we were born and will continue long after we are dust. Small flames in a fire that holds back the darkness and keeps humanity alive for one more day, one more year, one more millennium against the horrors that hunger for our extinction. I was cargo once. Now I am something more. And I would not trade what I have become for all the freedom in the galaxy, because I understand, at last, that freedom is a luxury the Imperium cannot afford, and that service is not slavery, but salvation, and that the black ships, which once seemed like the end of everything, I knew were actually the beginning of everything I was meant to be. This is my testimony. This is my truth. This is why no one ever escapes the black ships, and this is why, in the end, we do not wish to.